I was a clerk once. That is not a metaphor, nor a penitent euphemism. It was my designation, stamped in faded ink on a strip of synth parchment that hung from my neck for most of my waking life. Sub-level nutrient allocation, third shift. A life summarized in 12 words and a serial number. In the hive, that was considered a mercy. My station lay far below the manufactorum floors where the real light lived. Down there, illumination came secondhand, filtered through kilometers of ducting and grime, a perpetual dusk that never quite decided whether it was day or night. The lumen strips flickered with the patience of dying men. They hummed constantly a thin insect whine that burrowed into the skull. When they failed, and they often did, we worked by memory, hands tracing familiar grooves in rusted consoles, counting by habit rather than sight. I counted rations. Blocks of compressed nutrient paste slid down the conveyors in uniform gray stacks, each stamped with the aquila and an expiration date no one bothered to check. My duty was to log them as they passed, tallying distribution quotas against population registers that were never accurate. The registers said one thing, the faces at the dispensary gate said another. Children with hollow eyes, elders whose hands shook too badly to hold their chits steady, laborers who smelled of oil and chemical burns. I never saw their names, only their numbers, but numbers can scream if you stare at them long enough. Above my desk, bolted into the ferrocrete wall, hung a devotional plaque. It bore the emperor's sigil and a maxim etched deep enough to last centuries. Order is salvation. Each shift began with the same ritual. We stood, recited the catechism, touched our foreheads to the cold metal, and returned to our stations. The sermons piped through the Vox grills reinforced it hourly. The Imperium was vast. The Imperium was eternal. Suffering was proof of his love, because only a just ruler tested his people so thoroughly. I wanted to believe that. Throne help me, I wanted to. But the ledgers did not care about belief. They lay heavy on my desk, bound in cracked synth leather pages stiff with age and chemical spills. Each line recorded allocation, reduction, and loss. When a sector's ration count dipped below sustainability, the margin notes appeared. Adjusted, reassigned, terminated. There were symbols for everything, even death, especially death. Executions were neat affairs on paper, each one a tidy mark balancing a column. A food riot here, a labor slowdown there. Corrective measures applied. Population stabilized. Stabilized meant fewer mouths. I learned early not to linger on the discrepancies. The first time I noticed that our sublevels population had dropped by 5% in a single quarter, I recalculated twice, then a third time, convinced I had erred. When the number remained, I filed the report and said nothing. Questioning data was permissible. Questioning outcomes was not. Still, the unease settled in me like grit under the eyelid. Every day, I watched the ration total shrink while the sermons promised abundance through obedience. Every day, the execution tallies crept upward and the voxcasters called it purification. Order, they said. Balance. Necessary sacrifice. At night, if that word still meant anything, I returned to my hab cell, a coffin of metal and recycled air. The wall sweated condensation that tasted faintly of copper when it dripped onto my lips. Somewhere in the structure, machinery thudded endlessly, a colossal heart pumping resources upward, never downward. I lay on my cot and listened, counting the beats, wondering how many lives it took to keep that rhythm steady. It was there that the whispers began, not voices at first, more like thoughts that did not feel entirely my own. Questions I had been trained never to ask, slipping through the cracks left by exhaustion. Why do the numbers never favor you? Why does obedience always demand more? They came when the lights dimmed and the sermons fell silent, when even the hive seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was stress. Clerks broke all the time. Data fatigue, they called it, as if the weight of knowing too much could fracture the mind like brittle bone. I reported for my mandated psych evaluation and recited the approved responses. Loyal, grateful, content. The medici servitor's lends his word. Its mechadendrite pricked my skin, and it stamped my file fit for continued service. The whispers waited. They grew bolder as the weeks passed, threading themselves into my waking hours. When I logged another reduction order, they murmured of inevitability. When I watched a mother turned away from the dispensary gate because her chit had expired, they sighed, almost kindly. They have already abandoned you, the thought came, unbidden but persuasive. You are maintaining a fiction for a master who does not see this depth. I would grip the edge of my desk then, knuckles white, and recite the catechism under my breath until the feeling passed. Listening was not heresy, I reasoned. Thoughts were not actions. Everyone doubted, somewhere deep inside. The Imperium understood human weakness. That was why it was so strict. That was the first lie I swallowed. There were moments, small, sharp moments, when the truth pressed close enough to sting, like the day an execution tally crossed my desk with a familiar serial number attached, a fellow clerk from another shift, reassigned to penal labor months earlier. Official cause, dereliction of duty, no details, no body, just a line crossed out and replaced with a 0. I stared at it longer than I should have, my stomach twisting, and the whisper did not mock me then. It simply observed, you are already complicit. The sermons grew louder after that, as if the Vox system sensed unrest and compensated. The preacher's voice boomed through the ducts, rich with practiced fervor. He spoke of unity, of the emperor's infinite gaze, of the glory of serving even unto death. He never mentioned the ledgers. Well, he never mentioned starvation quotas or the neat arithmetic of despair. Faith, he said, was obedience without understanding. The whispers offered something different, not rebellion, not yet, just acknowledgement. You see the pattern they seem to say. You see the lie they call order. There was a strange comfort in that, a warmth like hands around a cup in a cold room. I hated myself for feeling it. I began to notice others then. Not openly, no one ever spoke of such things, but in glances held a second too long, in pauses during the catechism where a word came out half a beat late. A woman at the end of my row who traced unfamiliar symbols on her wrist when she thought no one was watching. A maintenance worker who slipped me an extra data slate once, his eyes flicking to the shadows as he did. We never spoke. We did not need to. The hive taught you to read absence as fluently as presence. One cycle, the ration shipment came in lighter than expected. Yeah. The manifest blamed transit losses, a catch-all phrase that covered theft, spoilage, and misallocation. The adjustment order followed within the hour. Cut distribution by 10%. Increase enforcement. I filed it, hands shaking despite myself. That night, the dispensary gates became choke points of anger and fear. Enforcers moved in, shock malls crackling, and the screams echoed up through the levels like a warning bell. From my station, I logged the consequences: injuries, arrests, executions. Each entry clean, precise, removed from the wet reality of it. The whispers did not speak during that shift. They did not need to. The ledger said everything. When I returned to my hab cell, I did not recite the catechism. I sat in the dark and let the silence stretch. My thoughts felt looser, as if a knot had been undone. You are not blind, the whisper came at last, almost approving. You are only trapped. I'm only listening. I told the empty room, my voice hoarse from disuse. I don't believe you. The words tasted like ash the moment they left my mouth, because some part of me already knew the truth. Belief was not a switch you flipped. It was a slow erosion, a surrender measured in justifications and small silences. The Imperium had taught me that well enough. It demanded compliance first, faith later. The whisper simply inverted the order. The next day I reported for duty as always. I touched my forehead to the plaque. I counted rations. I logged deaths. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, a fracture had formed, hairline but irreversible. The sermons washed over me, and for the first time, they sounded rehearsed, managed, like data curated to obscure an inconvenient reality. I told myself I could stop at any time, that listening did not obligate me, that I was still loyal, still pure. That was the first lie. and lies, like ledgers, accumulate interest. They did not approach me with banners or proclamations. There was no dramatic unveiling, no moment where a hood fell back and a villainous grin confirmed my worst fears. That would have been too honest, too clean. Instead, they came the way everything truly dangerous comes in the hive, through paperwork, routine, and an invitation that looked like another obligation I could not refuse. The summons arrived as a maintenance reassignment, stamped with a code I recognized but had never seen used for clerical staff. Data integrity verification, transit infrastructure. Official enough to deflect questions. Vague enough to swallow whole. I told myself it was a test, maybe even a promotion. That was another lie, smaller than the first but cut from the same cloth. The transit tunnel lay 3 levels below my usual routes, long decommissioned after a structural failure no one could afford to repair. The lifts did not go there. I walked down service stairs that spiraled endlessly, each step slick with condensation and something darker I chose not to examine too closely. The air grew colder the deeper I went, stale and metallic, tasting faintly of old fires and ozone. By the time I reached the access gate, my lungs burned as if I had been holding my breath for hours. The door recognized my ident code without comment. That should have frightened me more than it did. Inside, the tunnel stretched into darkness, its rails half buried under rubble and dust. Emergency lumens flickered weakly, casting the place in sickly amber pulses. Shadows leapt and recoiled with each cycle, giving the illusion of movement where there was none, or perhaps there was. I had learned by then that certainty was a luxury. They waited for me in the center of the tunnel. There were 6 of them, arranged not quite in a circle, leaving one space conspicuously empty. Their robes were utilitarian rather than ceremonial, patched and stained, bearing no overt symbols of rank or office. Faces hidden by hoods, hands bare and scarred. They could have been laborers, clerks, or priests. That ambiguity was deliberate. It made them harder to categorize, harder to report, even if I had wanted to. "We're late," one said, voice distorted slightly by a vox grill embedded in his throat. The sound made my teeth ache. There was no time specified, I replied automatically, the bureaucrat in me clinging to procedure like a flotation device. A soft chuckle rippled through the group, not mocking, appreciative. "A still counting rules," another murmured. "That will pass." The door behind me slid shut with a finality that reverberated through my bones. I turned instinctively, but there was nothing to be done. The access panel was dark, dead to my touch. Authority codes, I realized dimly. Stolen, repurposed, or gifted. In the hive, the difference hardly mattered. They gestured for me to step into the empty space. My legs moved before my mind finished arguing. Up close, I could smell them. Oil, old blood, incense layered over rot. The familiar perfume of institutions that had outlived their purpose. "You know why you're here," the first speaker said. "Owen, I don't," I answered, and that at least was true. "Oh, you've seen the margins," he continued, ignoring me. "The adjustments, the terminations. You've noticed the pattern and survived noticing it. That alone marks you." Marked, the words settled heavily in my chest. Another figure stepped forward, producing a small case from within her robe. She opened it with practiced care. Inside lay a blade, little more than a sliver of rusted metal wrapped in cloth. No power field, no sanctified etching. It looked like scrap, the kind I had seen used to pry open jammed ration crates. My mouth went dry. "This is unauthorized," I said weakly. "I should report." You already have," she replied calmly. "In every ledger you've ever balanced, they did not rush me. That was perhaps the cruelest part. They gave me time to think, to feel the weight of choice even as they dismantled it piece by piece. The hive teaches you that refusal is a privilege granted by those with leverage. Here, leverage had been removed along with the door. "What do you want?" I asked. "Aid to make you honest," the first voice said. "With us and eventually with yourself. They took my ident strip first. The thin synth parchment tore easily between gloved fingers. My serial number fluttered to the ground, trampled into dust without ceremony. I felt an irrational spike of panic at that, as if a vital organ had been removed. For the first time since my induction into clerical service, I was unrecorded. Names are liabilities, someone said. Numbers even more so. They held my arm out, palm up. The blade kissed my skin, cold and intimate. I flinched despite myself. The woman tightened her grip, surprisingly strong. "This will hurt," she said, not unkindly. "A pain clarifies." The cut was shallow but deliberate, drawn not along any medical line but in a shape that meant nothing to me. Blood welled dark and viscous, running down my wrist to drip onto the cracked concrete below. Each drop echoed in the tunnel, louder than it had any right to be. I clenched my jaw, focusing on the sensation, on the reality of it. This was happening. I was here. They cut again and again. Symbols emerged, crude and asymmetrical, scratched rather than carved. The blade dragged, catching on bone, sending jolts of white-hot agony up my arm. I bit down on a scream, tasting iron. Somewhere in the haze, I realized they were watching not the wound, but my reaction. When it was done, they pressed my bleeding arm against my chest, smearing the symbols across my robe, warmth soaked into the fabric, spreading, claiming space. Tease. The woman wrapped the blade and returned it to its case with reverence. "No records," the first speaker said. "Oh, no witnesses. This is not a contract the administratum would recognize." "Then it's meaningless," I said, clinging to logic like a prayer. Another chuckle, darker this time. On the contrary, contracts made in darkness are the only ones that last. They began to chant then, low voices overlapping, not in any language I recognized, but structured enough to feel intentional. The sound vibrated in my chest, setting my heart to a new rhythm. The tunnel seemed to shrink around us, the shadows pressing closer, the air thickening until each breath felt earned. I wanted to run. The urge was primal, overwhelming, but beneath it there was something else. Relief, a release of tension I hadn't known I carried. For the first time, someone was not pretending the suffering was noble or necessary. They acknowledged it, cataloged it, and offered a place within it. "Repeat," one commanded, and I realized the chant had paused, waiting. I hesitated only a moment before my lips moved. The words tasted strange heavy, as if they resisted being spoken aloud. With each repetition, the symbols on my arm burned, not like infection, but like pressure, a reminder that something had changed. The chant ended abruptly, silence crashing down like a held breath finally released. They stepped back, appraising me. "It's done," the woman said. "You are accounted for, accounted for." The irony bit deep. They gave me no pamphlet, no doctrine slate, no instructions beyond a single phrase whispered close to my ear. "When you hear us, listen." Then the door behind me opened, just like that, access panel glowing green as if nothing had happened. The lumens steadied. The tunnel looked like any other forgotten artery of the hive. If not for the blood soaking my sleeve and the throbbing pain in my arm, I might have convinced myself it was a stress dream. I walked back up the stairs in a daze, every step sending fresh waves of pain through my body. By the time I reached my hab level, the wound had clotted. The symbols crusted dark against my skin. I cleaned it as best I could with recycled water that stung like acid. No medikey, no report. I wrapped my arm and hid it beneath my uniform. At my next shift, my ident code failed to log in. Panic flared, sharp and immediate. Without a code, I did not exist in the system. Without existence, there was only reassignment, penal labor, or worse. I tried again and again. Each failure tightened the knot in my gut. Then the console flickered. A new designation appeared where my serial number had been. Not letters, not numbers. A string of symbols that made my eyes slide away when I tried to focus on them. Access granted. No one commented. The overseer did not look up. The sermons played as usual. The rations rolled by. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. I felt it in the way the whispers returned clearer now, less tentative. They no longer asked questions. They made statements. You are seen. You are counted. The pain in my arm pulsed in time with them, a metronome marking a new rhythm of obligation. I had not signed anything. I had not sworn loyalty to a name or banner, and yet, as I logged the day's execution tallies, I understood with a cold certainty that I was bound more tightly than ever before. The Imperium had erased me with indifference. What I had joined would never let me go. If induction was an erasure, then the days that followed were an education in what fills the void. They did not teach us theology in the way the ecclesiarchy did, with proclamations and approved interpretations. There were no grand myths, no promised paradises. Instead, there were schedules. I received them the way I received everything now, indirectly. A data slate left where I would find it. A maintenance notice rerouted through my console. Times, locations, expectations. Always precise, always deniable. The hive runs on timetables. Faith, I learned, could be made to fit the same mold. The first gathering after my induction took place in a repurposed storage vault. Its original purpose long forgotten. The walls were lined with rusted shelving that still bore the stains of whatever had once been stacked there. Chemicals, perhaps, or bodies. The air was thick with incense that failed to fully mask the underlying rot. It coated the tongue, making each breath an effort. Someone had set up lumen globes in a rough grid, their light dimmed to a perpetual twilight. There were more of us now. Not many, never many, but enough that I stopped trying to count. Faces were still hidden, but I began to recognize people by posture, by the cadence of their breathing, by the way pain made them flinch or hold steady. We did not greet one another. Individuality was a luxury we had already surrendered. At the center of the vault stood a set of tables fashioned from salvaged plasteel, scarred and pitted. Upon them lay tools. Some I recognized from manufactorum floors or medikey station. Others defied easy categorization, their shapes wrong in subtle ways, angles that seemed to shift when viewed too directly. I felt a low, persistent unease just looking at them, as if my body knew something my mind refused to articulate. The robed figures, our keepers, our recorders, took their places without ceremony. Each carried a slate or a bundle of parchments. One of them began to speak, voice flat and unadorned. A devotion is not declared, he said. It is demonstrated. Today we measure. The first ritual was fasting. That seemed almost gentle compared to what followed. We were given water, barely, and instructed to kneel in rows while chants filled the vault. Hours passed. My knees burned against the cold floor. My stomach cramped, hunger gnawed at me with renewed intensity after weeks of ration cuts. The chants did not inspire. They wore down. Repetition stripped the words of meaning until only rhythm remained. A metronome counting down to something inevitable. A scribe moved among us, noting tremors, labored breathing, lapses in concentration. When someone slumped or swayed too far, a keeper struck them with a rod that crackled faintly, enough to restore posture without leaving obvious marks. Failure was recorded, success too, but success, I soon learned, was never final. When the fasting ended, I thought foolishly that we might be released. Instead, they led us to the tables. I was second in line. I watched the first subject, a man whose shoulders shook even before he was restrained, laid out on the plasteel, straps tightened around his wrists and ankles. A keeper selected an instrument with the care of a surgeon. The scribe leaned in, slate ready. The scream, when it came, cut through the incense and lodged itself in my chest. It was raw, unfiltered, the sound of something essential being peeled away. I forced myself to watch. I told myself that looking away would be noted would count against me. The keeper worked methodically, never rushing, never lingering. Each incision precise, each reaction observed. The man passed out before it was finished. They revived him with a splash of cold water and continued. By the time they called my designation, my mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. My legs felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. I climbed onto the table without being told. That, too, was noted. The straps bit into my skin, unyielding. The ceiling above me was a patchwork of rust and old stains, patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I focused on them as the keeper approached. Up close, I could see his eyes behind the hood, calm, analytical, utterly uninterested in my fear. "This is not punishment," he said, perhaps sensing my rising panic. "It is calibration." The first cut was shallow, almost delicate. I hissed despite myself, muscles tensing against the restraints. He waited until I stilled before proceeding. The pain built gradually, layer by layer, a meticulous escalation designed to test thresholds. I lost track of time, minutes stretched into eternities. The chants resumed somewhere in the background, their rhythm syncing with my heartbeat. I learned things about myself on that table. How long I could endure before begging. How shame followed close on the heels of relief when the keeper paused. How quickly resolve eroded when pain became the only thing in the universe. At some point, I stopped trying to count the cuts. The scribe's stylus scratched relentlessly, recording every tremor, every cry. When they released me, I slid off the table and collapsed to the floor, limbs shaking. A keeper hauled me upright and shoved me toward the edge of the vault. There was no comfort offered, no reassurance. Only a murmured assessment as the scribe finalized his notes. "Acceptable," he said, "a room for improvement." The rituals continued, each more demanding than the last. Exposure to cold that left my skin numb and my thoughts sluggish. Chants that twisted syntax until language itself seemed unreliable. Trials of endurance where we were forced to hold agonizing positions while the keepers adjusted variables with clinical detachment. Pain was never random. It was applied with purpose, measured, compared. Failure was punished immediately. A missed response, a broken chant, a scream too early, or worse, too late. Punishments were not cruel for cruelty's sake. They were corrective, reinforcing lessons about limits and obedience. Success earned nothing but escalation. If you endured, it meant you could endure more. The keepers treated agony like data. They spoke of it in the same terms I once used for rations and execution quotas: thresholds, variance, yield. I heard echoes of my old life in their jargon and felt a sick, familiar satisfaction at understanding it. This at least was honest accounting. As the weeks passed, my dreams changed. I no longer dreamed of hab cells or ledgers. Instead, I saw shapes that refused to settle into Euclidean logic, angles folding into themselves, corridors that led inward rather than forward. I woke drenched in sweat, the symbols on my arm burning as if freshly cut. The whispers threaded through these dreams, no longer content to stay at the edges. They commented, corrected, approved. Pain is progress, they told me. Resistance is inefficiency. I repeated that to myself during the worst of it, clinging to the idea like a mantra. Pain meant I was moving somewhere, even if I could not see the destination. Pain meant I had not been forgotten. The air in the vault grew heavier with each gathering, saturated with incense and the copper tang of blood. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I began to smell it even outside the rituals, phantom scents that followed me through the hive. At my clerical station, as I logged another starvation adjustment, my hands trembled not from guilt but from remembered sensation. I had to hide a smile then, quickly suppressed. That frightened me more than any scream. There were others who broke, not all at once. A sob here, a whispered plea there. The keepers removed them quietly, efficiently. We never saw them again. Their absence was noted only in the reduced number of bodies kneeling in the vault. I told myself they had failed. I did not ask what failure meant in this context. The whispers did not elaborate. I lasted. That became my quiet point of pride, a seed of something darker taking root. I lasted through fasting that left my vision swimming, through cold that cracked my lips and numbed my fingers, through pain that redefined itself again and again, always finding new ways to demand attention. Each time I endured, the keepers marked it, and the whispers purred approval. By the end of that phase, if phases truly existed anymore, I understood the lesson they were carving into us. Faith was not belief. Belief was irrelevant, mutable, easily corrupted. Endurance was immutable. It could be measured, recorded, improved. Faith was how long you could scream without breaking. I told myself the pain meant progress. That was not a lie exactly. It was worse. It was an alignment. There came a night when the ritual stopped pretending to be preparation. Up until then, everything had been framed as conditioning, of flesh, of reflex, of will, pain as calibration, endurance as proof, but preparation implies a future event, a moment toward which all suffering is angled. That night, in the deepest vault we had yet been allowed to enter, I realized with a sick clarity that the future had already arrived, and we were merely catching up to it. They called it a vigil. The location was not listed on any slate. Instead, the instruction came as a pressure behind my eyes, a sense of now that brooked no delay. I followed it through service corridors I had never seen, down shafts that should not have existed according to any schematics I knew. The hive architecture grew stranger. The deeper I went, less concerned with load-bearing logic and more with enclosing space. Walls curved where they should have been straight, angles met at subtly wrong degrees. My footsteps echoed back to me out of sequence. The chamber at the end was vast, carved from bedrock or something older pretending to be stone. No lumens burned there. The only light came from braziers arranged in a complex pattern across the floor, their flames an unnatural blue that gave off no heat. The air was bitterly cold, frosting my breath. The smell was different too, less rot, more ozone. Like the moments before a catastrophic power surge. We gathered without speaking, drawn into positions that felt preordained. I took my place on a sigil etched directly into the stone, its lines filled with something dark and viscous that reflected the blue fire. My arm burned in response, the old symbols aching as if they recognized kin. The keepers were present, but diminished. They stood at the periphery now, heads bowed, slates forgotten. For the first time, I sensed uncertainty in them. Not fear, never fear, but anticipation edged with caution. That more than anything unsettled me. The chanting began softly, a low vibration rather than sound. It resonated in my bones, setting my teeth on edge. The temperature dropped further, the cold seeping through my boots, my skin into places I had no words for. The flames guttered, stretching sideways as if drawn towards some invisible center. I felt it before I understood it. A pressure immense and intimate at once, as though the space inside my skull had been invaded by something vast and curious. My thoughts slowed, then fragmented. I could still think, but the privacy of thought, something I had always taken for granted, was gone. I was being read. Panic flared, sharp and useless. I tried to pull back, to retreat into myself, but there was no inside left to hide in. The presence pressed closer, rifling through memories with clinical interest. I felt moments of my life replayed and recontextualized. The ledgers, the ration cuts, the first whispers. Each memory was weighed, judged, not morally but functionally. Was this useful? Was this sufficient? Ecstasy and horror arrived together, inseparable. My nerves sang with sensation, every touch amplified to agony or pleasure without distinction. I laughed and screamed at the same time, the sounds torn from me without conscious intent. Around me, others did the same, their voices overlapping into a discordant chorus that echoed through the chamber. Some fell. I saw it out of the corner of my eye, bodies collapsing as if strings had been cut. One woman convulsed violently, her spine arching at an impossible angle before snapping back with a wet crack. Another man clawed at his own face, shrieking until his throat tore. The presence did not withdraw from them. If anything, it seemed to press harder, curious about the limits of flesh. Look, the whispers urged, no longer separate from the presence but woven into it. Witness what you asked for. I had not asked for this. I would have sworn it if I had been capable of speech. But the thought rang hollow even as it formed. I had listened. I had endured. I had aligned myself with the logic that brought this into being. Denial felt absurd in the face of such attention. The presence turned its full regard on me then. There are no words adequate to describe being seen like that. Not observed, not scrutinized, but known in a way that stripped context and justification away. Every compromise I had made, every lie I had told myself, laid bare and evaluated. Approval and contempt pressed into my nerves simultaneously, a paradox that made me sob with something like gratitude. I felt my body begin to fail. My knees buckled, muscles spasming as if caught between conflicting commands. My vision fractured into overlapping layers, the chamber dissolving into shapes that intersected and reassembled according to rules I could not grasp. The sigil beneath me burned white hot, and for a moment I was certain my flesh would simply slough my bones. Others were not so fortunate. A scream cut short as a body lifted from the ground, limbs elongating grotesquely before collapsing into a boneless heap. Another figure swelled, skin splitting as something inside sought egress. The keepers watched, rapt, making no move to intervene. This was not failure. This was data. I did not collapse. The realization came dimly through the haze of sensation. I was still standing, shaking, screaming, but upright. The pressure intensified, drilling deeper, probing for cracks. I had no strength left to resist, so I did the only thing that seemed possible. I yielded, not in the sense of surrendering agency. I had none left, but in accepting the evaluation. I let the present see me without filters, without excuses. I let it measure my endurance, my utility, my willingness to be reshaped. The whispers surged, triumphant. Yes, they seemed to say, this will do. The pressure receded, not all at once but in reluctant increments, like a tide withdrawing from a claimed shore. The blue flame steadied. The cold lessened, though it never truly left. I slumped forward, hands braced on my knees, gasping air that felt newly heavy. Silence fell, profound and ringing. When I looked up, the chamber was changed. Not physically, stone was still stone, fire still fire, but something fundamental had shifted. The presence lingered at the edges of perception, watchful, no longer actively probing, but far from gone. A door had been opened, and it would not close simply because we wished it to. The keepers moved among us then, finally active. They checked pulses, examined bodies with practiced efficiency. Those who still lived were separated from those who did not. And the dead, or what passed for them, were gathered and removed through apertures I had not noticed before. There was no ceremony. Their fate had been sealed the moment the presence judged them insufficient. A keeper stopped in front of me. For the first time he knelt, bringing his masked face level with mine. "You remained," he said quietly. "That is, noted." I wanted to ask what it meant. I wanted to demand why I had survived when others had not. But the words would not come, and in their absence, understanding crept in uninvited. Survival was not a reward, it was a designation. As we filed out of the chamber, stepping carefully around dark stains on the stone, I felt the presence brush against my thoughts one last time. Not invasive now. Familiar, proprietary. We are watching, it impressed upon me. With neither kindness nor malice, I believed it. From that night on, I was never alone again. The whispers no longer pretended to be separate from me. They were part of the background hum of existence, like the lumen strips of my old station. Sometimes quiet, sometimes deafening, always there. I had looked into the abyss the hive warned us about, and it had looked back, measured me, and decided I was worth keeping. That knowledge sat heavy in my chest, a weight I would never set down.